I was cleaning my garage when a police officer knocked on my door. "Sir, your wife was in a fatal car accident an hour ago." It was impossible. "No, she's upstairs asleep." The officer looked confused. I led him upstairs to our bedroom. Officer drew his weapon. "Sir," he said, "step away from her. That isn't." So there I was, elbow deep in my garage sanctuary, wrestling with the guts of my '98 Camaro like some grease-stained suburban warrior. The engine had been giving me grief all week, sputtering and wheezing like my old man after his third pack of Marlboros. But hey, at least car problems make sense. You diagnose the issue, you fix it, and boom, problem solved. If only life worked that way, right? The radio was blasting some classic rock garbage that made me feel younger than my 42 years, and I was actually enjoying myself for once. No office politics, no client complaints, no Marissa nagging me about tracking oil through the house. Just me, my tools, and the satisfying challenge of bringing something broken back to life. Call it therapy for guys who refuse to admit they need therapy. Then came the knock. Not the friendly, "Hey neighbor, got a beer?" kind of knock. This was the official, "Your life's about to get royally screwed" variety. 3 sharp raps that cut through my metallic-induced haze like a machete through butter. I wiped my hands on an old rag that had seen better decades and trudged to the door, already annoyed at whatever Girl Scout or Jehovah's Witness was about to waste my Saturday afternoon. But it wasn't a kid peddling cookies or salvation. Standing on my doorstep was Officer Bruce Jackson, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on planet Earth. The guy was built like a linebacker, but carried himself with the weight of bad news. His uniform was soaked from the October rain that had been hammering our little slice of suburbia all day, and his hat sat in his hands like he was attending a funeral. Which, as it turned out, he basically was. "Sir," he started, and already I didn't like where this was heading. "Cops don't show up at your door on Saturday to tell you you've won the lottery. Are you David Mercer?" "Depends who's asking." I shot back, because being a smart-ass is apparently my default setting when I'm nervous. "But yeah, that's me. What's this about, officer?" Jackson cleared his throat and looked me dead in the eye with the kind of expression they probably teach at cop school, somewhere between sympathetic and professional, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but hoped he'd never have to use. "Sir, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Your wife, Marissa Mercer, was involved in a fatal car accident approximately an hour ago." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Fatal accident. Marissa. My brain tried to process this information, but it felt like trying to solve calculus while drunk. For a moment, the world went completely silent except for the sound of rain hitting the pavement and my own heartbeat doing a drum solo in my ears. Then I did something that probably seemed completely insane to Officer Jackson. I laughed. Not a happy laugh, mind you, but one of those bitter, incredulous sounds that bubbles up when reality decides to take a hard left turn into crazy town. "No," I said, shaking my head like a dog trying to get water out of its ears. "No, that's impossible. You've got the wrong guy, wrong house, wrong universe maybe. Marissa's upstairs asleep. She's been battling a headache all day and went to bed early." The confusion that spread across Jackson's face should have been my first clue that something was seriously off in Denmark. Cops deal with denial all the time. They're probably used to people refusing to accept bad news. But this wasn't denial confusion. This was, "What the hell is this guy talking about" confusion. "Sir," he said slowly, like he was talking to someone who might be having a mental breakdown, "we have positive identification. The vehicle was registered to Marissa Mercer at this address. We found her purse, her driver's license." "Then you found the wrong purse," I interrupted, already heading toward the stairs. "Come on, I'll show you. She's right upstairs, probably wondering why we're making so much noise." Jackson followed me, his hand instinctively moving to rest near his service weapon, a detail that should have sent up more red flags than a communist parade, but I was too focused on proving him wrong to notice. We climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, and I called out like I had 1,000 times before. "Marissa, honey, there's someone here who thinks you're dead. Come tell this nice officer how very much alive you are." I pushed open the bedroom door with the confidence of a man who was absolutely certain he was about to make a cop look like an idiot. The room was dark, curtains drawn against the gray afternoon light, but I could see the familiar shape under the covers. Blonde hair fanned across the pillow, just like always. My wife, my Marissa, exactly where I'd left her. See, I said triumphantly, reaching for the bedside lamp. One very much alive. The light clicked on, and Officer Jackson's entire body went rigid. His hand moved to his gun with the kind of speed that suggested years of training and several close calls with danger. "Sir," he said in a voice that had gone from sympathetic to deadly serious in about half a second, "step away from the bed. Now." "What? What?" But even as I asked the question, my brain was starting to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The hair was right, the clothes looked familiar, but there was something off about the way the body lay there. Too still. Too perfect. That isn't a person, Mr. Mercer," Jackson said, his weapon now partially drawn. "That's a mannequin." My stomach dropped somewhere into the vicinity of my shoes. A mannequin. Not my wife. Not a person at all. Just a department store dummy dressed up in Marissa's clothes, wearing her jewelry, positioned in our bed like some sick joke. For a moment that felt like a century, I just stood there staring at this thing that had fooled me completely. The makeup was perfect, the wig was Marissa's exact shade of blonde, even down to the little curl she always got behind her left ear. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to create this illusion. But why? "Mr. Mercer," Jackson's voice cut through my shock. "I'm going to need you to explain what's going on here. Where is your wife?" That's when it hit me. The realization that made my blood run colder than a Minnesota winter. This wasn't some random coincidence. This wasn't grief making me hallucinate. Someone had planned this. Someone had carefully, deliberately set up this elaborate charade. Someone wanted me to believe Marissa was both dead and alive simultaneously. I thought back to this morning, to Marissa kissing me goodbye before I headed to the garage. Her lips had been cold, I remembered now. Unusually cold. And she'd seemed distant, distracted. She'd claimed she had a headache and was going to rest. But looking back, there had been something else in her eyes. Something that looked almost like guilt? "I don't know," I whispered, and for the first time in my adult life, I meant it completely. I honestly don't know where my wife is. Outside, I could see my neighbor Tom Redding pretending to rake leaves while obviously straining to hear every word. The whole neighborhood would be buzzing about this within the hour. David Mercer, whose wife died in a car accident, but was also sleeping upstairs as a mannequin. It sounded like the setup to a really twisted joke, except nobody was laughing. Jackson was talking into his radio, calling for backup and crime scene techs, but his words sounded like they were coming from underwater. My world had just been flipped upside down and shaken like a snow globe, and I was still trying to figure out which way was up. But even in my shock, one thought kept hammering at my brain like a persistent headache. This level of planning, this attention to detail, this elaborate setup, it wasn't the work of some random psychopath. This was personal. This was someone who knew me, knew Marissa, knew our routines and our house, and exactly how to make me look like either a victim or a suspect. Someone had set the stage for the performance of a lifetime, and I was standing right in the middle of it, not knowing if I was supposed to be the hero, the villain, or just another prop in someone else's twisted game. The rain kept falling outside, washing away whatever evidence might have been there, and I stood in my bedroom staring at a fake version of my wife while trying to figure out where the real one had gone and why she'd left a mannequin in her place. Welcome to the worst Saturday of my life. Let me tell you something about mannequins. They're creepy as hell under the best circumstances. Stick one in a department store window wearing the latest fall fashion, and it's just another part of the retail landscape. But dress one up in your wife's favorite pajamas, complete with her wedding ring and that little scar on the wrist from when she tried to cook Thanksgiving dinner in 2018, and suddenly you're living in a Stephen King novel. I couldn't stop staring at the thing. Whoever had crafted this masterpiece of deception had clearly majored in how to mind screw your husband 101, with a minor in theatrical design. The attention to detail was absolutely insane, and I mean certifiably, straitjacket-worthy insane. They'd even painted a tiny beauty mark on the left shoulder, the one Marissa always complained about, but I'd always found adorable. For about 30 seconds there, I'd been completely fooled. Hell, I'd been ready to introduce Officer Jackson to my very much alive wife and watch him shuffle away red-faced with apologies. Instead, I was standing in my bedroom feeling like I'd been sucker-punched by reality, while a cop treated me like I might be the next subject of a Netflix true crime documentary. Jesus Christ, I muttered. running a hand through my hair. This is seriously messed up. Jackson was all business now, his earlier sympathy replaced by that cop-mode suspicion that probably kept him alive on the streets. His eyes kept darting between me and the mannequin like he was trying to figure out if I was a grief-stricken widower or a complete psychopath. "Mr. Mercer," he said, and his voice had that careful, measured tone they use when they think you might snap at any moment. "I need you to walk me through your day. When was the last time you actually saw your wife, your real wife, alive and moving around?" That should have been an easy question. Married couples see each other all the time, right? Morning coffee, quick kisses goodbye, mundane conversations about whose turn it is to take out the trash. Except when I really tried to think about it, my brain kept hitting these weird blank spots. "This morning," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt wrong somehow. "She kissed me before I went out to work on the car. Said she had a headache and was going to lie down." What time was that? Around 10, maybe 10:30? I was trying to sound confident, but doubt was creeping in like water through a cracked foundation. She seemed, I don't know, off. Distracted. Jackson was scribbling in his little notebook like my life story was suddenly fascinating literature. Off how? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? How do you explain that your wife of 16 years seemed like a stranger in her own skin? That her kiss felt mechanical, like she was going through the motions? That she'd been clutching her phone like it contained state secrets? She's been weird lately, I admitted, hating how that sounded but unable to come up with a better description. Secretive. Always on her phone, jumping when it rang. New perfume, new clothes, staying out later than usual. I figured she was planning something for our anniversary next month, you know? Maybe a surprise trip or something. The look on Jackson's face suggested he was thinking about entirely different kinds of surprises. The kind that involved divorce lawyers and private investigators, not romantic getaways. Any marital problems, Mr. Mercer? Financial troubles? Anyone who might want to hurt either of you? Standard questions, I guess, but they hit uncomfortably close to home. Our marriage had been, well, let's just say we weren't exactly poster children for wedded bliss lately. The spark had dimmed somewhere between the mortgage payments and the routine of middle-aged suburban life. We'd become roommates more than lovers, two people sharing space and bills, but not much else. But hurt us? That seemed extreme. Nothing that would lead to this, I said, gesturing at the mannequin. We had our issues, sure, but what couple doesn't after 16 years? We weren't fighting or anything. Just coasting, I guess. Jackson's radio crackled to life, some dispatcher babbling about crime scene units and additional officers. The cavalry was coming, which meant my house was about to become Grand Central Station for every cop, detective, and forensics nerd in the county. That's when I noticed Tom Redding had abandoned all pretense of yard work and was standing at the edge of my property with his phone out, probably live streaming the whole drama to Facebook. Nothing like a good neighborhood scandal to spice up a boring Saturday, right? Wonderful, I muttered. The vultures are gathering. Jackson followed my gaze and nodded grimly. We'll need to canvass the neighborhood anyway. Someone might have seen something unusual. Unusual? Yeah, because my life hadn't crossed that line about 20 minutes ago. As we waited for backup, I found myself studying the mannequin more closely, looking for clues about who might have created this elaborate fake-out. The craftsmanship was professional. This wasn't some Halloween store dummy dressed up for kicks. Someone with serious skills had put this together. The jewelry, I said suddenly. That's Marissa's actual jewelry. The wedding ring, that bracelet I got her last Christmas, even those little diamond earrings she wears every day. Jackson perked up. You're sure? Positive. I should know. I paid for most of it. I leaned closer, being careful not to actually touch anything. Which means whoever did this had access to her personal belongings. They didn't just study her from a distance. They got close enough to take her things. Or she gave them willingly, whispered a nasty little voice in the back of my head. Maybe this wasn't some stranger's elaborate scheme. Maybe this was an inside job. The sound of sirens was getting closer, and I could see neighbors starting to emerge from their houses like prairie dogs sensing drama. Mrs. Henderson from across the street was pretending to water plants that had been dead since July, while the college kids next door had abandoned their perpetual video game marathon to gawk from their front porch. Mr. Mercer, Jackson said, I have to ask, do you have somewhere you can stay tonight? Family, friends? This house is going to be a crime scene for a while. Crime scene. The words hit me like a slap. My home, the place where Marissa and I had built our life together, was now officially a crime scene. Yellow tape and fingerprint powder and strangers trampling through our private spaces, looking for clues to a mystery I didn't even understand yet. My brother, I said automatically. Daniel. He lives about 2 hours away. Good. I'll need his contact information. Jackson was still writing in that damn notebook. One more thing. Can you think of anyone who might have known your wife's schedule well enough to predict when she'd be away from the house? That question made my stomach clench, because the truth was, lots of people knew Marissa's routines. Her co-workers at the marketing firm, her book club friends, her tennis partners. Hell, even Tom Redding probably knew more about our comings and goings than I did, considering how much time he spent lurking around his front yard. But there was one name that kept surfacing in my mind, even though I didn't want to acknowledge it. Julian Hart, my business partner and supposed best friend. Julian, who'd been spending an awful lot of time at our house lately, always with some excuse about work projects or client meetings. Julian, who knew our schedules because he helped create them. Julian, who Marissa always seemed a little too happy to see. The first police cruiser was pulling into my driveway, followed by an unmarked sedan and what looked like a mobile crime lab. My quiet suburban Saturday had officially become a circus, and I was apparently the main attraction. I looked at the mannequin one more time, this perfect replica of my wife lying in our bed like some twisted sleeping beauty. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to create this illusion, but why? What was the point of making me think Marissa was both dead and alive? Unless the point wasn't to fool me. Maybe I was never supposed to find the mannequin. Maybe it was meant for someone else entirely. Someone who would come looking for Marissa and find this fake version instead. But if that was true, then where the hell was my real wife? And why had she left me holding the bag for whatever game she was playing? The cops were at my front door now, and I could hear Jackson's voice directing them upstairs. My life was about to be dissected by strangers, every private moment examined for clues to a puzzle that seemed to have more pieces missing than present. I just hoped that when they put it all together, I'd still recognize the picture they found. The next 3 days felt like living in some alternate reality where everything looked normal, but nothing actually made sense. The police had turned my house into their personal playground, dusting for fingerprints and bagging evidence like they were shopping at a crime scene clearance sale. I'd been staying at a Holiday Inn that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, eating takeout Chinese food and watching news reports about my own life like I was some random spectator instead of the guy living this nightmare. The media had latched onto the story like vultures on roadkill. Mysterious mannequin case baffles police. Husband discovers fake wife in bed. Is this murder or elaborate hoax? The reporters were having a field day with my misery, turning my personal hell into primetime entertainment for people eating dinner and pretending to care about strangers' tragedies. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Sometimes it gives you the clarity to see what you should have noticed all along. Sitting in that crappy hotel room, surrounded by empty takeout containers and my own spiraling thoughts, I finally admitted what my gut had been screaming for months. Something was seriously wrong with my marriage, and it wasn't just the usual middle-aged doldrums. So I did what any reasonable man would do when his life exploded into 1,000 pieces. I called my little brother. Daniel Mercer was everything I wasn't, spontaneous where I was methodical, rebellious where I played by the rules, and annoyingly perceptive about people's bullshit where I preferred to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. He'd become a private investigator after washing out of law school, claiming he preferred real detective work to pushing papers for corporate scumbags. We hadn't talked much lately, mainly because he'd spent our last conversation telling me I was drowning in suburban mediocrity and needed to wake up before life passed me by. Turned out the little bastard might have been onto something. David. His voice sounded surprised when he picked up. Jesus, I heard about Marissa on the news. Are you okay? Define okay, I said, staring at the water stain on the hotel ceiling that looked disturbingly like a map of my current mental state. My wife is supposedly dead, but someone left a mannequin in our bed dressed like her, and the cops are treating me like I'm either a victim or a suspect, depending on what day it is. Holy shit. Daniel had never been one for subtle reactions. That's seriously messed up, even by my standards. Where are you now? Holiday Inn on Route 9. Living the dream and eating lo mein for breakfast. Listen, Danny, I need your help. Something's been off with Marissa for months, and I think this whole thing might be connected to whatever she's been hiding. There was a pause, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Daniel might be a screw-up in the traditional sense, but when it came to sniffing out lies and deception, the guy was like a bloodhound with trust issues. What kind of off, he asked. So I told him everything. The late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. The new clothes that definitely weren't purchased on our usual budget. The way she'd started password protecting her laptop and keeping her phone face down during dinner. The sudden interest in girls' nights out that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency. And you never thought to, I don't know, ask her about any of this? Daniel's tone had that familiar edge of little brother superiority that used to make me want to give him a wedgie. I'm not the jealous husband type, I said defensively. I trusted her. We've been married 16 years. You don't just start spying on your wife because she's acting a little weird. Dude, Daniel said, and I could hear him shaking his head through the phone. You're not the jealous type. You're the oblivious type. There's a difference. 3 days later, Daniel showed up at my hotel room, carrying a manila folder that looked like it weighed about as much as my remaining faith in humanity. He'd always been the kind of guy who could dig up dirt on a saint, but I wasn't prepared for the archaeological expedition he'd apparently conducted into my wife's secret life. Sit down, he said, which is never what you want to hear when someone's holding evidence of your personal catastrophe. That bad? I asked, but I was already reaching for the bottle of whiskey I'd picked up at the liquor store next to the hotel. Some conversations require liquid courage. That bad? He opened the folder like he was revealing classified government secrets, which in a way, I guess he was. The first photo hit me like a sucker punch to the solar plexus. Marissa, my wife of 16 years, walking out of the Marriott downtown with her hand on the arm of Julian Hart, my business partner and supposed best friend. Son of a bitch, I whispered. It gets worse, Daniel said, spreading out more photos like he was dealing cards in the world's worst poker game. Marissa and Julian in his car. Marissa and Julian having lunch at a restaurant I'd never heard of. Marissa and Julian looking at each other like they were teenagers sneaking around behind their parents' backs. But the real kick in the teeth came with the next batch of photos. Marissa meeting with some guy I didn't recognize in a coffee shop, sliding him an envelope thick enough to choke a horse. Then another meeting, this time with a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a spy movie, all designer clothes and suspicious glances. Who are these people? I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. The guy's name is Lucas Kane, Daniel said, consulting his notes like he was reading my obituary. He's what you might call a life transition specialist. Helps people who want to disappear start fresh somewhere new. New identities, new backgrounds, the whole 9 yards. And the woman? That's where it gets really interesting. She works for a company that specializes in financial, let's call it redistribution. They help people move money around in ways that make it very difficult to track. I poured myself another whiskey and tried to process this information. My wife wasn't just cheating on me. She was planning to vanish completely, taking God knows how much of our money with her. There's more, Daniel said, and I realized he was just getting warmed up. I managed to get into some of her online activity from the past 8 months. She's been taking pictures, David. Lots of pictures. He pulled out printouts of what looked like insurance documents, bank statements, and business contracts. All taken with a phone camera, all from my home office. My private files, my company documents, even the safe combination I'd written down and hidden in my desk drawer like an idiot. She's been documenting your entire financial life, Daniel said. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, insurance policies, business partnerships. This isn't just about running away with her boyfriend. This is about taking you for everything you're worth. I stared at the evidence of my wife's betrayal, feeling like I'd been living with a stranger for months without realizing it. Every kiss, every "I love you," every moment of supposed marital contentment had been a lie while she systematically prepared to destroy my life. How long? I asked. Based on what I can trace, at least 8 months of active planning. But the thing with Julian probably goes back further than that. 8 months. While I'd been working my ass off to build our future, she'd been planning my destruction. While I'd been worrying about her headaches and mood swings, she'd been photographing my most sensitive documents and planning her escape route. So what now? I asked. I mean, the cops think she's dead, but she's obviously not. Do I tell them about this? Do I file for divorce against a dead woman? What's the protocol here? Daniel leaned back in the uncomfortable hotel chair and gave me that look, the one that meant he was about to suggest something that would either save my life or land me in federal prison. You could do that, he said slowly. You could be the good little Boy Scout, turn over all this evidence, and let the system sort it out. Marissa and Julian would probably get arrested eventually. You'd lose half your assets in a messy divorce, and your business would probably tank from all the negative publicity. Or, Daniel said, and his smile was absolutely predatory. You could let them think their plan is working while you put together a much better one. I looked at my little brother, sitting there in that crappy hotel room with evidence of my wife's betrayal spread out like a battle plan, and realized that maybe it was time to stop being the good guy who always played by the rules. After all, they'd started this game. The least I could do was finish it. Tell me more, I said, and poured another drink for both of us. Because apparently, I was about to become someone I'd never been before, someone who fought back instead of just taking the hit. And honestly, after 16 years of being the reliable, trustworthy, predictable husband, the idea felt pretty damn good. They wanted to erase me? Fine. Let's see how they liked being erased instead. Planning revenge, it turns out, is a lot like planning a wedding. Except instead of choosing flowers and cake flavors, you're figuring out how to systematically destroy the people who tried to destroy you first. And let me tell you, I was about to throw the wedding of the century. The beauty of Marissa and Julian's plan was also its fatal flaw. It relied entirely on me being the same trusting, oblivious schmuck I'd been for the past 16 years. They'd counted on me playing the grieving widower while they disappeared into their new life with my money, never suspecting that good old reliable David might actually have some teeth hidden behind all that suburban niceness. Well, surprise, motherfuckers. Turns out the family dog can bite when you corner him. Daniel and I spent the next week holed up in that hotel room like a couple of conspiracy theorists, mapping out every detail of their scheme and figuring out how to turn it inside out. The plan that emerged was beautiful in its simplicity. If Marissa wanted to fake her death, I'd let her. Hell, I'd help her. The only difference was that her new life wouldn't be quite the tropical paradise she was expecting. First, I needed someone to play the corpse. That's where Riley Ward came in, a favor I'd been saving for years without knowing it. Riley was former military, the kind of woman who could disarm a bomb or perform field surgery with equal competence, and she owed me big time for helping her get her security contractor business off the ground when she left the service. More importantly, she had the kind of moral flexibility that made her perfect for what I had in mind. You want me to what now? Riley asked when I called her with my proposition. Even over the phone, I could hear the amusement in her voice. She'd always appreciated a good con job. Play dead, I repeated. One car accident, very convincing, very final. You'd be the body they find in the wreckage instead of Marissa. And your actual wife won't be quite as dead as she's hoping to be. There was a pause, then Riley's characteristic laugh, the sound of someone who'd seen enough real combat to find civilian problems entertainingly absurd. This is the most fucked up favor anyone's ever asked me for. I love it. When do we start? While Riley handled the theatrical side of things, I turned my attention to home renovations. Amazing what you can accomplish with a little creativity, some soundproofing materials, and 16 years of accumulated knowledge about your house's quirks. The basement had always been my domain anyway. Marissa hated going down there, claiming it was too dark and creepy. Perfect. I built her a little apartment down there, complete with bathroom facilities, a comfortable bed, and even a flat-screen TV. Call it a subterranean bed and breakfast, except the checkout time was entirely up to me. The soundproofing was professional grade. Couldn't have the neighbors getting curious about any unusual noises, after all. But the real masterstroke was flipping Lucas Kane, their so-called life transition specialist. Turns out Mr. Kane had some interesting tax issues with the federal government, and a few phone calls to the right people made him very eager to discuss alternative employment opportunities. Funny how quickly a man's loyalty shifts when he's looking at potential jail time. Your wife and her boyfriend are planning something big, Kane told me during our clandestine meeting at a truck stop outside town. He looked like the kind of guy who sold fake IDs to college kids, which wasn't far from the truth. They want to accelerate the timeline. Something about you getting suspicious. How accelerated? This weekend. The accident's supposed to happen Saturday afternoon on Route 116, that stretch with all the curves. Your wife will be driving to visit her sister in Albany. I almost laughed. Marissa's sister lived in Phoenix and hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. If I'd been paying attention, that alibi alone would have blown their whole scheme. And after the accident, I pick up the real package from a rendezvous point about 5 miles from the crash site. Then it's new identities and a trip to Costa Rica, where your business partner has been setting up some very nice offshore accounts. Not anymore, I said, sliding him a new envelope thick with cash. Here's what's actually going to happen. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, perfect weather for a tragic accident. I spent the morning in the garage again, just like the week before, except this time I wasn't working on the car. I was waiting for the phone call that would tell me the show had begun. The call came at 2:47 p.m. Officer Jackson's voice was appropriately somber as he delivered the news I'd been expecting. Mr. Mercer, I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your wife. I played my part perfectly, rushing to the hospital, demanding to see the body, breaking down in controlled grief when they told me the remains were too badly damaged for viewing. Riley had done her job beautifully. The accident looked absolutely convincing, complete with Marissa's purse and jewelry scattered around the wreckage. The dental records would match because we'd made sure they would. Meanwhile, about 30 miles away, Lucas Kane was picking up a very different package than he'd been expecting. Instead of my conscious, eager to escape wife, he found Marissa unconscious in the back of his van, courtesy of some pharmaceuticals Riley had provided. By the time my dear wife woke up, she'd already been delivered to her new home, my custom-built basement suite. The beauty of the whole operation was its symmetry. Marissa had wanted to disappear, to erase herself from our life, and start fresh somewhere else. Well, congratulations, honey, mission accomplished. She was now officially dead to the world, exactly as she'd planned. The only difference was that her new world was a 10-by-12 room beneath the house, where she'd spent 16 years lying to me. Julian, of course, was frantically trying to reach both Marissa and Kane, not knowing that one was legally dead and the other was now working for me. I could picture him pacing around his apartment, checking his phone every 30 seconds, wondering why his carefully orchestrated plan seemed to be falling apart. Poor Julian. He was about to discover that some people are much better at playing chess than others realize. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday, a closed casket affair, naturally, given the condition of the body. I'd already started receiving casseroles from well-meaning neighbors and condolence cards from people I barely knew. The whole neighborhood was rallying around the poor widower, offering support and sympathy for my tragic loss. If they only knew that my dead wife was currently sitting in my basement watching her own memorial service on closed-circuit television, they might have been a little less generous with their tuna noodle casseroles. But that was the beautiful thing about small-town life. People saw what they expected to see. A grieving husband getting support from his community. A tragic accident that claimed a young woman's life. A neighborhood coming together in the face of loss. They didn't see the security cameras I'd installed throughout the house, or the reinforced steel door I'd put in the basement, or the way I smiled just a little too broadly when people offered their condolences. They certainly didn't see Marissa, very much alive and finally getting a taste of what it felt like to be trapped in someone else's plan. The game was just beginning. And for the first time in months, I was the one holding all the cards. Marissa had wanted to play dead? Fine. Now she could find out exactly what that felt like, permanently. After all, she'd made her choice when she decided to erase me from her life. Now I was simply returning the favor, with interest. Welcome to your new life, darling. I hope you enjoy the accommodations. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone's world collapse in real time, especially when that someone spent months planning your destruction. Call it karma, call it justice, or just call it good old-fashioned revenge. Whatever you want to label it. I was enjoying every second of Marissa's slow realization that her brilliant escape plan had turned into her worst nightmare. She woke up around 6 in the evening, about 4 hours after Kane delivered her to my custom-built hospitality suite. I'd been monitoring her through the security cameras I'd installed, watching her sleep with the kind of peaceful expression she hadn't worn around me in months. Funny how relaxed people look when they think they're about to get everything they want. The first thing she did was call out for Julian, which told me everything I needed to know about who she'd been thinking about during those last conscious moments. Not her husband of 16 years, not the life she was leaving behind, but her new boyfriend and their shiny future together. Well, honey, that future just got a serious revision. When she finally opened her eyes and took in her surroundings, the confusion on her face was absolutely priceless. This clearly wasn't the safe house or private jet she'd been expecting. Instead of tropical beaches and offshore bank accounts, she found herself in a windowless room with cement walls, tasteful lighting, and all the charm of a high-end prison cell. "What the hell?" she whispered, struggling to sit up on the bed I'd so thoughtfully provided. The drugs were still working their way out of her system, making her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. I let her marinate in confusion for a few more minutes before activating the intercom system. No point in rushing the big reveal. I'd waited months for this moment, and I intended to savor it properly. "Good evening, Marissa," I said, my voice echoing through the speakers with perfect clarity. "I hope you slept well. You're going to need your energy for what comes next." The way her head snapped up toward the sound was like watching a deer realize it's wandered into a hunter's crosshairs. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of my voice, finally settling on the camera mounted discreetly in the corner. "David." Her voice cracked slightly, and I could hear 16 years of marriage in that single word. The familiarity, the confusion, and now the growing terror. "David, what is this? Where am I?" "You're exactly where you wanted to be, sweetheart," I replied, settling back in my office chair upstairs like I was watching my favorite TV show. Dead to the world, starting fresh, beginning a whole new life. "Congratulations, you got everything you asked for." I clicked on the monitor that showed the local news coverage of her death, complete with footage of the accident scene and interviews with neighbors expressing their shock and grief. The anchor was doing that serious news voice thing they all learn in journalism school, describing the tragic loss of a beloved community member. In other news, I continued conversationally. "Your funeral is scheduled for Thursday." I went with the closed casket option, given the condition of the body. "Very tasteful service. I think you'd approve of the flower arrangements." Marissa was staring at the screen in absolute horror, watching her own death being reported like she was witnessing some alternate reality. Her hands were shaking as she pressed them against the walls, looking for a way out that didn't exist. "This is insane," she said, and her voice was getting stronger as the drugs wore off and the reality of her situation sank in. "You can't keep me here. People will look for me." "Julian will." "Julian will what?" I interrupted, genuinely curious about what she thought her boyfriend was going to do. "Julian thinks you're dead, remember? That was the plan. Your plan. The only difference is that instead of sipping Mai Tais on a beach in Costa Rica, you're getting a front row seat to your own memorial service." I switched the feed to show Julian's apartment, where my business partner was currently pacing around like a caged animal, frantically trying to call Lucas Kane and getting sent straight to voicemail. The poor bastard had no idea that his carefully orchestrated scheme had been hijacked by someone who played the game better than he did. "Take a good look, Marissa," I said, zooming in on Julian's panicked face. "That's the man you chose over me. The one you were willing to destroy our marriage for. Watch how concerned he is about your well-being." Julian was on his phone again, but he wasn't calling hospitals or police stations. He was calling his lawyer, his accountant, anyone who could help him figure out what had gone wrong with their plan. Not once did he seem genuinely worried about Marissa as a person. She was just another asset that had failed to materialize. "He doesn't give a damn about you," I continued, enjoying the way Marissa flinched with each word. "You were just a convenient way to get access to my money and my business. Now that the plan's gone sideways, he's already working on how to save his own ass." The truth was hitting her like a series of physical blows. I could see it in her face, the gradual understanding that she'd been played just as much as I had, maybe more. Julian had used her feelings for him to turn her into a weapon against her own husband, and now that the weapon had misfired, he was cutting his losses. "You're lying," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. She was watching Julian on the screen, seeing the same selfish panic that I was seeing, and the evidence was pretty damn conclusive. "Am I?" I asked. "Let's test that theory, shall we?" I switched to another camera feed, this one showing Julian's latest phone call. The audio was crystal clear thanks to some very expensive surveillance equipment Daniel had helped me install. "I don't care where she is," Julian was saying to someone on the other end. "The whole thing's blown up. I need new papers and a way out of the country before the feds start asking questions about those offshore accounts." Marissa's face went white as she listened to the man she'd betrayed her marriage for discussing her disappearance like a minor inconvenience. No concern for her safety. No questions about whether she was hurt or scared or in danger. Just cold, calculating self-preservation. "Still think he loves you?" I asked. She slumped against the wall, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw something in her eyes that looked like genuine regret. Not for getting caught, not for the failure of her plan, but for the choices that had led her to this moment. "Why?" she whispered. "Why this instead of just, I don't know, divorce? You could have taken half of everything and walked away." "Half?" I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Marissa, you weren't planning to leave me half of anything. You were planning to take it all and disappear. Those photos you took of our financial documents, the meetings with your identity specialist, the offshore accounts Julian set up, you wanted to erase me completely." I leaned forward, speaking directly into the microphone so she could hear every word clearly. "So that's exactly what I'm doing to you. You wanted to be dead to the world? Congratulations. You're officially deceased, buried, mourned, and forgotten. Your old life is over, just like you planned. The only difference is that your new life comes with some unexpected accommodations." She was crying now, finally understanding that her elaborate scheme had turned into her own prison. Every decision she'd made, every lie she'd told, every betrayal she'd planned had led her to this windowless room where she could watch the world move on without her. "Please," she said, and the word came out broken and desperate. "Please, David. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I can fix this. We can fix this." "Fix what?" I asked. "Our marriage? That died months ago when you started planning my destruction. Your relationship with Julian? He's already abandoned you. Your old life? That's buried 6 feet under with Riley Ward playing your corpse." I stood up from my chair, getting ready to head downstairs for our first face-to-face conversation since her death. "No, Marissa," I said. "There's nothing left to fix. There's only what comes next, and for the first time in months, I'm the one who gets to decide what that looks like." The look of absolute despair on her face was everything I'd hoped for and more. She'd played the game of deception and betrayal, thinking she was so much smarter than her boring, predictable husband. Now she was about to learn what it felt like to be completely at someone else's mercy. And frankly, after what she'd put me through, my mercy was in pretty short supply. While Marissa was getting acquainted with her new accommodations and the crushing reality of her situation, I had a business partner to deal with. Julian Hart had always been the slick one in our partnership. Designer suits, perfect hair, and the kind of smile that made clients think they were getting something special. Too bad he'd never learned the difference between being clever and being smart. The beauty of having someone like Daniel in your corner is that private investigators know all sorts of interesting people, including several who specialize in making bad situations look a whole lot worse than they actually are. Within 24 hours of Marissa's death, Julian was about to discover that his problems were just getting started. I spent Monday morning playing the grieving widower, accepting condolences from coworkers and nodding sadly when people told me how sorry they were for my loss. Julian showed up at the office around 10, looking like he'd spent the weekend wrestling with his conscience and losing badly. His usual polished appearance was slightly off, wrinkled shirt, 5 o'clock shadow at 10 in the morning, and eyes that darted around like he was expecting federal agents to burst through the windows at any moment. "David," he said, putting on his best friend act and wrapping me in one of those awkward man hugs that's supposed to convey deep emotion. "Jesus, man, I'm so sorry. I can't believe Marissa's gone." The irony was absolutely delicious. Here he was, comforting me over the death of the woman he'd been planning to run away with, and he had no idea that she was currently sitting in my basement watching this whole performance on closed-circuit television. "Thanks, Julian," I said, playing my part with the kind of understated grief that would make community theater directors weep with joy. I can't wrap my head around it, you know?" She was fine when I left for the garage that morning, and then I let my voice trail off and ran a hand through my hair, the picture of a man struggling to hold it together. Julian nodded sympathetically, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was probably wondering if I suspected anything, if I'd found any evidence of their affair, if his carefully constructed alibi was going to hold up under scrutiny. What he didn't know was that his alibis were about to become the least of his problems. "Listen," he said, glancing around the office like he was worried about being overheard. "If you need anything, time off, help with the business, whatever, just say the word. We're partners, but more than that, we're friends. I've got your back." Friends. Right. The kind of friend who spends months planning to destroy your life and steal your wife. But I just nodded gratefully and told him I appreciated the support. That afternoon, while Julian was at lunch with a client, the first shoe dropped. Two men in cheap suits showed up at our office, flashing badges and asking questions about Julian's recent financial activities. They were actors Daniel had hired, armed with fake IDs and enough authentic-looking paperwork to fool anyone who wasn't expecting to be conned. "We're with the Financial Crimes Division," the taller one announced to our receptionist, loud enough for half the office to hear. "We need to speak with Mr. Julian Hart about some irregularities in his banking records." By the time Julian returned from lunch, the entire office was buzzing with rumors about federal investigations and financial crimes. The fake agents had left behind just enough paperwork to make it look official, including a very convincing subpoena for Julian's financial records. I watched him read the subpoena through my office window, and it was like watching a man realize his house was on fire while he was still trapped inside. His face went through about 6 different shades of pale before settling on a sickly green that matched his expression perfectly. He was in my office within minutes, closing the door behind him and trying to look casual while his entire world crumbled around his ears. "David," he said, attempting his usual confident tone and failing spectacularly, "I need to talk to you about something. There might be some complications with some of my personal investments." "Complications?" I asked, raising an eyebrow with just the right amount of concern. "What kind of complications?" "It's probably nothing," he said, but the sweat beading on his forehead suggested otherwise. "Some mix-up with offshore accounts, international transfers, that kind of thing. You know how paranoid the feds are about money laundering these days. The beautiful thing about guilty people is how eager they are to explain away their crimes before anyone even accuses them of anything." Julian was basically confessing to financial fraud while trying to make it sound like a clerical error. "Should I be worried about the business?" I asked. "I mean, if there are federal investigators looking into your finances." No, he said quickly, too quickly. "This is completely separate from our partnership. Personal stuff. Nothing that affects the company at all." He was lying, of course. The offshore accounts he'd set up were meant to hold my money after he and Marissa cleaned out our joint assets and disappeared. But watching him try to cover his tracks while panicking about an investigation that didn't actually exist was better than cable television. That evening, I headed downstairs to give Marissa a front-row seat to her boyfriend's meltdown. She was sitting on the bed I provided, staring at the blank monitor screen like she could will it to show her something different than the truth. "Evening news time," I announced cheerfully, switching on the feed from Julian's apartment. Tonight's episode, watching a guilty man try to figure out how screwed he really is. Julian was on his phone again, but this time he wasn't calling lawyers or accountants. He was calling Lucas Kane, the identity specialist who was now working for me, begging for an emergency extraction. "I need new papers tonight," Julian was saying, pacing around his living room like a caged animal. "The whole thing's blown up. There are federal agents asking questions, and I need to be gone before they connect me to the offshore accounts." Marissa was watching with the kind of horrified fascination you'd reserve for a car accident happening in slow motion. This was the man she'd chosen over 16 years of marriage. A coward who was ready to abandon her the moment his own comfort was threatened. "Still think he's your knight in shining armor?" I asked. She didn't answer, but I could see the tears streaming down her face as she watched Julian throw their entire relationship under the bus to save himself. "He's not even asking about you," I continued. "Not wondering if you're safe, not concerned about what happened to you, just worried about his own skin." The phone call continued, with Julian growing more desperate by the minute. Kane was stringing him along beautifully, making promises about new identities while secretly recording every word for my entertainment. "Where does he think you are right now?" I asked Marissa. "Does he think you're dead like everyone else?" Or does he know you were supposed to be picked up after the fake accident? He thinks. She started, then stopped, her voice catching. He thinks I'm waiting at the safe house. He thinks Kane picked me up, and I'm just waiting for him to join me. And yet he's planning to run without you, I observed. Interesting priorities your boyfriend has. On the screen, Julian was now offering Kane double money for immediate extraction, no questions asked. He was willing to abandon Marissa, abandon their plan, abandon everything as long as he could save himself from consequences that were mostly imaginary. This is the man you destroyed our marriage for, I said quietly. This is who you thought was worth throwing away 16 years of history. Take a good look, Marissa. This is what love looks like when it's tested. She was sobbing now, finally understanding that she'd been played by someone who cared about her even less than she'd ended up caring about me. Julian had used her feelings to turn her into a weapon against her own husband, and now that the weapon had backfired, he was cutting his losses without a second thought. Please, she whispered, not looking away from the screen. Please turn it off. I can't watch anymore. Oh, but this is just the beginning, I said, settling into a chair I'd placed specifically for these viewing sessions. Tomorrow, things get really interesting. You wanted a front row seat to a new life, remember? Well, here it is. Your boyfriend's about to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong guy's family. The panic in Julian's voice was music to my ears, and the despair on Marissa's face was the perfect harmony. They'd started this game thinking they were so much smarter than everyone else, so much more deserving of happiness and wealth and freedom. Now they were about to discover that sometimes the quiet, reliable guy in the corner is the most dangerous player at the table. The thing about destroying someone's life is that timing is everything. You can't just blow up their world all at once. That's amateur hour, the kind of revenge that lacks artistry and leaves everyone feeling unsatisfied. No, proper destruction requires patience, precision, and the kind of dramatic build-up that would make Shakespeare proud. Julian Hart was about to get the full theatrical experience. I'd spent Tuesday night setting the stage while he panicked in his apartment, calling every contact he had in his desperate attempt to disappear before the fake federal investigation closed in on him. What he didn't realize was that his frantic phone calls were being monitored by Daniel, who was building a beautiful case file of actual criminal activity to hand over to the real authorities. See, here's the thing about fake investigations. Sometimes they uncover real crimes. Julian's offshore accounts weren't just theoretical. They were stuffed with money he'd been skimming from our business for months. His panic had led him to move funds around in ways that violated about 17 different federal banking laws. The irony was absolutely delicious. My fictional frame-up was about to become a very real prosecution. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzly. Perfect weather for watching a man's life implode in spectacular fashion. I got to the office early, positioning myself with a clear view of the parking lot and a fresh cup of coffee. The show was about to begin, and I didn't want to miss a single moment. Julian showed up at 8:47 a.m. looking like he'd spent the night wrestling with demons and losing badly. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his designer suit looked like he'd slept in it, and his eyes had that wild, cornered animal look that comes from knowing you're completely fucked but not knowing exactly how fucked you are yet. He was carrying a briefcase that I knew contained fake passports, cash, and probably a one-way ticket to somewhere without extradition treaties. Poor bastard actually thought he was going to make it out of this mess. At 9:15 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled into our parking lot with the kind of synchronized precision that screams federal law enforcement. But these weren't Daniel's actors. These were the real deal, complete with authentic badges, actual arrest warrants, and the kind of serious expressions that come from years of putting white-collar criminals behind bars. I watched through my office window as Julian saw the vehicles and literally stumbled backward, his face going through that same sick color palette I'd enjoyed so much the day before. His hands were shaking as he fumbled for his phone, probably trying to call Lucas Kane for that emergency extraction that was never going to come. The agents moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the building while their colleagues marched through our front entrance like they owned the place. Our receptionist pointed them toward Julian's office, and I could see her mouth forming the words, "He's right over there," with the helpful enthusiasm of someone who had no idea she was directing a man's complete destruction. Julian tried to run. actually tried to bolt for the back exit like he was in some kind of action movie, clutching his briefcase full of evidence and moving with all the grace of a panicked giraffe. The agents were on him before he made it 10 feet, professional and polite as they explained that he was under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit tax evasion. The look on his face when they cuffed him was absolutely priceless. Pure, undiluted terror mixed with the dawning realization that his carefully constructed life was over. He kept looking around the office like he expected someone to rescue him, to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, to make it all go away with the right phone call or the right amount of money. But there was no rescue coming, no last-minute reprieve, just the cold, hard reality of federal agents reading him his rights while his co-workers watched through office windows with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. "David," he called out as they led him toward the exit, his voice cracking with desperation. "David, you have to help me. Call my lawyer. This is all a mistake." I stepped into the hallway, putting on my best expression of shocked concern. "Julian? What's happening? What's going on?" "It's about the offshore accounts," he said, and I almost laughed at how eager he was to confess his crimes in front of witnesses. "The federal investigation, it's all a misunderstanding. I can explain everything." One of the agents paused in the doorway, looking back at me with professional interest. "Sir, are you Mr. Mercer? We may need to speak with you as well, given your business partnership with the defendant." "Of course," I said, playing the cooperative citizen perfectly. "Whatever you need." I had no idea Julian was involved in anything illegal, which was technically true. I'd known he was planning to steal from me, but I hadn't known about the money laundering operation he'd been running on the side. Apparently, Julian had been even busier than I'd realized. They led him away in handcuffs while news crews gathered in the parking lot like vultures at a feast. By noon, Julian's arrest was the lead story on every local news channel, complete with footage of him being stuffed into the back of a federal vehicle and speculation about the extent of his crimes. That afternoon, I made my way downstairs to share the good news with Marissa. She was sitting exactly where I'd left her, staring at the blank monitor screen with the kind of hollow expression that comes from having your entire worldview shattered in the span of a few days. "Have I got a treat for you?" I announced cheerfully, switching on the news feed. Today's episode: the complete and total destruction of your boyfriend's life and freedom. The footage of Julian's arrest played across the screen in glorious high definition, every moment of his humiliation captured for posterity. Marissa watched in silence as reporters discussed federal charges, potential prison sentences, and the ongoing investigation into his financial crimes. 25 years, I said conversationally, reading from the news ticker at the bottom of the screen. That's the maximum sentence for the charges they've filed so far, though I suspect they'll find more violations once they really dig into his finances. She didn't respond, just kept staring at the screen as they showed file footage of Julian in happier times, glad-handing clients, cutting ribbons at charity events, posing for business magazine profiles. All of that was gone now, replaced by mugshots and perp walks and the kind of infamy that follows you forever. "You know what the beautiful part is?" I continued, settling into my viewing chair. "He did this to himself. All I did was shine a light on crimes he'd already committed. The offshore accounts, the money laundering, the tax evasion, that was all him. I just gave the authorities a reason to look." The news shifted to an interview with one of the federal agents, who explained that this was just the beginning of their investigation. They'd found evidence of a much larger operation involving multiple co-conspirators and millions of dollars in illegal transfers. "They're going to want to make a deal," the agent was saying. "Someone facing this many charges, looking at this much prison time, they usually have a lot to say about their associates and accomplices." I glanced at Marissa, who had gone very still. She was smart enough to understand the implications. Julian was going to roll over on everyone he could think of to reduce his sentence, including her. Except she was officially dead, which made her both the perfect scapegoat and completely unreachable for questioning. "Looks like your boyfriend's going to try to blame you for everything," I observed. "Good thing you're dead, right? Can't prosecute a corpse, can't put a ghost in prison. You should probably send him a thank you card." For the first time since I'd brought her down here, Marissa looked directly at me instead of at the screen. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why go to all this trouble? You could have just turned us in from the beginning." Because, I said, leaning forward so she could see the absolute sincerity in my eyes. Turning you in would have given you a chance to explain, to make excuses, to play the victim. This way, you get to watch everything you thought you wanted turn to ash, and you get to live with the knowledge that you did it to yourself. The news was showing Julian's mugshot now, side by side with a photo from our last company Christmas party. The contrast was striking, from successful businessman to federal prisoner in less than a week. He never loved you, I said quietly. Not the way I did, anyway. You were just a tool he used to get what he wanted, and now that tool has broken. He's going to throw you away to save himself. She was crying again, but these weren't tears of self-pity. These were tears of understanding, of finally seeing the truth that had been staring her in the face all along. Julian Hart was going to prison, his life and reputation destroyed beyond repair. And the woman he'd used and abandoned was going to spend the rest of her life knowing that she'd chosen him over a husband who had actually loved her. Sometimes justice really is beautiful. 2 weeks. That's how long it took for Marissa to finally break down and ask for a face-to-face meeting. 2 weeks of watching her former life play out on the monitors above her head while she sat in her subterranean prison, coming to terms with the fact that everything she'd thought she knew about love, loyalty, and Julian Hart had been a carefully constructed lie. I have to admit, she lasted longer than I'd expected. Most people would have cracked after a few days of solitary confinement with nothing but their own guilt and the crushing weight of their bad decisions for company. But Marissa had always been stubborn. It was one of the things I'd admired about her back when I still thought she was the woman I'd married instead of the stranger who'd spent months planning my destruction. The request came through the intercom on a Thursday evening, her voice hoarse from crying and rough from 2 weeks of minimal conversation. "David," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in every syllable. "Please, I need to see you. Face to face. Just please." I'd been waiting for this moment, planning for it, rehearsing what I would say when she finally reached the point where she understood exactly how completely she'd screwed herself. But hearing the defeat in her voice, the absolute brokenness of a woman who'd finally run out of hope, I felt something I hadn't expected, a tiny, almost imperceptible twinge of the love I'd once felt for her. Almost. I made her wait another hour before I went downstairs, because even broken people need to understand who's in control. When I finally opened the steel door to her little apartment, she was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, like a child waiting to be scolded. She looked like hell. 2 weeks without natural sunlight, without her usual skincare routine, without the expensive salon treatments she'd always considered essential, had stripped away the polished veneer of the woman who'd kissed me goodbye that last morning. Her hair hung limp and unwashed, her skin was pale and blotchy, and her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. This was what Marissa looked like without the armor of her carefully constructed life, and the sight of her hit me harder than I'd anticipated. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice neutral as I took the chair I'd placed in the corner for exactly this moment. "You wanted to talk?" She looked up at me, and for a second I saw a flash of the woman I'd fallen in love with 20 years ago, vulnerable, uncertain, reaching out for comfort that she wasn't sure she deserved. "Why?" she whispered. "Why this instead of divorce? You could have taken half of everything and walked away. You could have destroyed me in court, taken our daughter, made me the villain in a very public breakup. Why this elaborate revenge?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself during the quiet moments when I wasn't actively orchestrating her psychological torture. The answer was more complicated than I'd expected it to be. "Because divorce would have been civilized," I said finally. "Divorce would have implied that we were two reasonable adults who'd simply grown apart, who could shake hands and split our assets and wish each other well. But that's not what happened, is it?" She shook her head, tears starting to flow again. "What happened," I continued, "is that you decided I was disposable, not worth the effort of couples therapy or honest conversation or even the basic courtesy of asking for what you wanted. You decided that the easiest solution was to erase me completely. Take my money, destroy my business, disappear with my partner, and leave me with nothing but the wreckage of a life I'd spent 20 years building." "I know," she said, and her voice was barely audible. "I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But David, keeping me here like this, it's not going to bring back what we had." I don't want back what we had. I replied, and I meant it. What we had was built on a lie. You spent our entire marriage pretending to be someone you weren't, and I spent it being too blind and trusting to see what was right in front of my face. Why would I want that back? She was crying harder now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. Then what do you want? What's the point of all this? That was the question, wasn't it? What did I want from this elaborate revenge scheme? What was the end game that would make all the planning and expense and risk worthwhile? I want you to understand what it feels like, I said quietly. To have your entire life stripped away by someone who's supposed to love you. To watch everything you thought was real turn out to be a performance. To realize that the person you trusted most in the world saw you as nothing more than an obstacle to their happiness. I understand, she said desperately. I do understand. I see what I did to you, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, David. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I regret every choice I made. Do you? I asked. Do you regret cheating on me, or do you regret getting caught? Do you regret planning to destroy my life, or do you regret that your plan failed? She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the kind of honest self-reflection that our marriage had lacked for years. Both, she said finally. I regret all of it. The affair, the planning, the lies, the betrayal. But mostly I regret not having the courage to just talk to you about how unhappy I was. It was the first genuinely honest thing she'd said to me in months, maybe years. And despite everything she'd done, despite the elaborate revenge I'd constructed around her betrayal, I found myself believing her, which made what came next both easier and harder than I'd expected. Here's what's going to happen, I said, leaning forward in my chair. You have a choice to make. Option 1, you stay dead. Permanently. I've created a very comfortable life for you down here. Better food, more entertainment options, even some books and puzzles to keep your mind occupied. You'll be safe, fed, clothed, and completely erased from the world above. Her eyes widened in horror. David, you can't. Option 2. I continued, cutting off her protest. I help you disappear for real. New identity, new background. Enough money to start over somewhere far away where no one will ever connect you to Marissa Mercer or this whole mess. You get to live, but you lose everything. Your name, your history, your family, your daughter. The mention of our daughter hit her like a physical blow. Lila was 19, a sophomore in college, and as far as she knew, her mother had died tragically in a car accident. The funeral had been beautiful, the grief genuine, and Lila's tears over her mother's grave had been some of the most heartbreaking moments of my life. Lila, Marissa whispered. My baby girl. How is she? Is she okay? She's fine, I said. Sad, obviously, but handling it better than I expected. She's stronger than either of us gave her credit for. Could I see pictures? Just to know she's all right. And there it was, the one request I'd been waiting for, the one thing I could give her that might make this nightmare worthwhile for both of us. If you choose option 2, I said, if you agree to disappear completely and never try to contact either of us again, I'll make sure you get pictures. Updates on how she's doing, major milestones, that kind of thing. Not often, and not forever, but enough to know she's happy and healthy. She was sobbing again, but this time it wasn't just grief and self-pity. This was the sound of a mother's heart breaking as she realized she was about to lose her child forever. Why would you do that? She asked. After everything I've done, why would you be kind to me? Because despite everything you've done, I said, you're still Lila's mother. And because somewhere underneath all the lies and betrayal, there's still a tiny piece of the woman I used to love. The choice I was offering her wasn't really a choice at all. Option 1 was slow psychological torture disguised as mercy, while option 2 was exile and erasure with just enough humanity to make it bearable. But it was more than she'd planned to give me, and we both knew it. How long do I have to decide? She asked. You don't, I replied, standing up from my chair. You've already decided. You just need to say it out loud. She looked up at me with eyes that held 20 years of shared history, the good times and the bad, the love and the betrayal, the beginning and now the end. I want to see my daughter grow up, she whispered. Even if it's just in pictures. Even if she never knows I'm alive. Then it's settled, I said, heading for the door. Tomorrow, you become someone else entirely. And Marissa Mercer stays buried where she belongs. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the woman who'd been my wife, my partner, my biggest mistake, and my most elaborate revenge. For what it's worth, I said, I'm sorry it came to this. So am I, she replied. So am I. 3 months after Marissa Mercer was buried in Greenwood Cemetery, Clara Hayes walked into Murphy's Hardware in Whitefish, Montana, carrying a resume that was completely fabricated and a story about starting over after a messy divorce. The owner, a gruff 60-something guy named Frank Murphy who'd never met a sob story he couldn't relate to, gave her the job managing his books and inventory without asking too many questions. Clara was everything Marissa had never been: quiet, modest, grateful for simple work and a small apartment above the store. She wore secondhand clothes from the local thrift shop, kept her hair pulled back in a plain ponytail, and lived the kind of unremarkable life that wouldn't attract attention from anyone, least of all federal investigators looking for connections to Julian Hart's financial crimes. I'd done my homework when creating her new identity. Clara Hayes had a perfectly boring background. Born in Oregon, moved around a lot as a kid, parents died in a car accident when she was 25, no siblings, no close friends, no social media presence worth mentioning. She was the kind of person who could disappear into small-town America without leaving so much as a ripple. Meanwhile, back in my actual life, things were going better than they had in years. Hart and Mercer had become just Mercer Consulting after Julian's very public downfall, and business was booming. Turns out that being the innocent victim of your business partner's financial crimes makes you look trustworthy and competent by comparison. Clients who'd been on the fence about working with us suddenly saw me as the stable, reliable choice in an industry full of sharks and con artists. The insurance payout from Marissa's death had been substantial, $250,000 that went straight into a trust fund for Lila's future. My daughter was thriving at college, throwing herself into her studies with the kind of focused determination that suggested she'd inherited the best parts of both her parents. She called me every Sunday, and our conversations had become deeper and more meaningful than they'd ever been when Marissa was alive. Grief, it turned out, had a way of cutting through the bullshit and forcing people to focus on what really mattered. I'd even started dating again, carefully and cautiously, but with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. There was something liberating about being completely honest about who I was and what I wanted, instead of trying to maintain the fiction of a happy marriage that had been dead for longer than I'd cared to admit. But the most satisfying part of my new life was the monthly ritual I'd established with Clara Hayes. Every fourth Saturday, I'd drive to a post office box in a town about 50 miles away and mail an envelope to a P.O. box in Whitefish, Montana. Inside were photographs: Lila at her college graduation ceremony where she'd made Dean's List, Lila volunteering at a local animal shelter, Lila on spring break with friends who clearly adored her. Never anything that could be traced back to me. Never anything with identifying information. Just proof that our daughter was happy, healthy, and growing into the kind of young woman any parent would be proud of. I never included letters or explanations, just the photos and sometimes a newspaper clipping if Lila had been mentioned in the campus paper for some academic achievement. It was enough to let Clara know that her sacrifice hadn't been meaningless, that the daughter she'd given up to save was thriving in her absence. In return, Clara Hayes lived the kind of invisible life that kept her safe from discovery. She went to work, paid her bills, attended the occasional town function, and never, ever tried to contact anyone from her former life. She'd become exactly what I'd offered her the chance to become: a ghost of herself, alive but erased, breathing but dead to everyone who'd ever mattered to her. About 6 months into this arrangement, Clara made a mistake. It was small, the kind of slip that most people would never notice, but I'd been monitoring her online activity through some very sophisticated software Daniel had helped me install. She'd searched for Lila Mercer on the public computers at the Whitefish Library, probably hoping to find news about her daughter that went beyond my carefully curated photo updates. The search lasted less than 5 minutes before she realized what she was doing and logged off, but it was enough to trigger the alerts I'd set up. Within an hour, Clara Hayes' internet service was mysteriously discontinued due to routine maintenance issues that would take several weeks to resolve. Her phone service developed similar problems, leaving her effectively cut off from the outside world. The message was clear: stick to the agreement, or lose even the small mercies I'd been providing. She never tried to search for us again. As the months turned into a year, I began to understand something about revenge that I'd never considered before. It wasn't just about making someone pay for what they'd done to you. It was about finding a way to live with what they'd taken from you. And sometimes that meant taking something equally precious from them. Marissa had tried to erase me from existence, to steal my life and leave me with nothing but the ashes of 20 years of marriage and partnership. So I'd erased her instead, more completely and permanently than she'd ever planned to erase me. She was alive, which made it more merciful than what she'd planned for me. But she was also dead to everyone who'd ever loved her, which made it more cruel. The genius of it was that she'd chosen this fate herself. I hadn't forced her into exile. I'd simply offered her a choice between two kinds of imprisonment, and she'd picked the one that let her hold onto a tiny thread of connection to the daughter she'd betrayed along with me. Julian, meanwhile, was serving his time in federal prison, probably spending his days wondering how his carefully planned escape had turned into a life sentence. The offshore accounts he'd set up to hold my stolen money had been seized by the government, along with everything else he'd accumulated through years of financial fraud. He'd lost his freedom, his wealth, his reputation, and his future, all because he'd underestimated the quiet guy in the corner office who paid attention to details. Sometimes I wondered if Clara Hayes ever thought about the life she'd thrown away, if she ever regretted choosing Julian Hart over the husband who'd loved her despite her flaws. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all. She'd become what she'd always been in the end, irrelevant to my happiness, unnecessary for my future, a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal. Lila called me on a Tuesday evening in November, bubbling with excitement about her plans for Thanksgiving break and her new boyfriend who wanted to meet her family. She sounded so much like her mother had at that age, enthusiastic, optimistic, full of dreams about the future, that it took my breath away for a moment. "I wish Mom could meet him," she said, and there was still sadness in her voice when she talked about Marissa, but it was the clean grief of loss rather than the complicated pain of betrayal. She would have loved him. He's studying engineering, just like you. She would have. I agreed, and meant it. The Marissa that Lila remembered, the loving mother who'd never missed a school play or soccer game, had been real, even if the wife I'd thought I knew had been a fiction. "I love you, Dad," Lila said. "I'm proud of how strong you've been through everything." "I love you too, sweetheart," I replied. "More than you'll ever know." After we hung up, I sat in my office looking at the photos on my desk. Lila at various stages of growing up, the family we'd been before betrayal had poisoned everything, the life we'd built together before I'd learned how much of it had been a lie. Tomorrow I'd mail another envelope to Montana. Another set of pictures showing Clara Hayes that the daughter she'd sacrificed everything for was thriving without her. It was a small cruelty wrapped in mercy, a reminder that some choices couldn't be undone and some prices were too high to ever fully pay. But tonight, I was just a father who loved his daughter and a man who'd found his way back to happiness after having it stolen from him. Sometimes justice wasn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it was simply about rebuilding something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. And sometimes that was enough. 5 years. That's how long it took for our carefully constructed house of cards to face its ultimate test. 5 years of Clara Hayes living her invisible life in Montana. 5 years of me building something better from the ashes of my destroyed marriage. And 5 years of Lila growing into the kind of young woman who made every sacrifice worthwhile. The day was perfect. One of those crisp May afternoons that made you believe in fresh starts and happy endings. I was standing in the packed auditorium of State University, watching my daughter walk across the stage to receive her engineering degree, and feeling proud enough to burst. She'd graduated summa cum laude, landed a job with a prestigious firm in Seattle, and was planning to move in with the boyfriend I'd actually grown to like, a rare achievement for any father of a 24-year-old daughter. Lila looked radiant in her cap and gown, beaming as she shook hands with the dean and posed for the official photographer. 5 years of grief had taught her to appreciate life's victories, to savor moments like this instead of taking them for granted. She'd channeled her pain over losing her mother into academic excellence and a determination to make the most of every opportunity. As I watched her accept her diploma, I thought about all the people who weren't there to see this moment. Marissa, who'd loved Lila more than anything in the world, but had chosen her own selfish desires over being present for her daughter's future. Julian, who was still serving his federal sentence and would probably die in prison. All the people who'd been part of our lives before betrayal had burned everything down and forced us to rebuild from scratch. The ceremony was long, as these things always are, filled with speeches about bright futures and endless possibilities. I found myself scanning the crowd during the boring parts, looking at all the proud families taking pictures and recording videos of their graduates. Somewhere in that sea of faces, I spotted the university president's wife, a few local politicians trying to look important, and my blood turned to ice. There, in the back row of the auditorium, wearing oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low over her face, was a woman I'd have recognized anywhere. Older, thinner, dressed in the kind of generic clothing you'd find at any Walmart, but unmistakably the person who'd once been my wife. Clara Hayes had broken the cardinal rule of our arrangement. She'd left her exile in Montana and come to see the daughter she was supposed to be dead to forever. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years, genuine fear. Not for myself, but for Lila. What if Clara tried to approach her? What if she decided that 5 years of hiding was enough and attempted some kind of reunion? What if she destroyed the careful peace we'd built by injecting herself back into our lives? I watched Clara watching our daughter, and even from across the crowded auditorium, I could see the tears streaming down her face. This was probably the first time she'd seen Lila in person since faking her own death, and the girl she was looking at was completely different from the college freshman she'd left behind. Lila had grown up in her absence, matured into an adult who'd learned to navigate the world without her mother's guidance. Clara's hands were shaking as she raised a small camera, probably one of those disposable ones you can buy at gas stations, and took a few pictures. She was being careful not to use the flash, trying to remain invisible while documenting the moment she'd traveled 1,000 miles to witness. Part of me wanted to march over there and drag her out of the auditorium before she could cause any damage. Part of me wanted to have security escort her away and then make some calls to ensure she never got this close to our life again. But another part of me, a part one didn't particularly like acknowledging, understood exactly why she was there. This was her daughter too. Despite everything she'd done, despite the choices she'd made and the price she'd paid for them, Lila was still her child. And watching your child graduate from college was the kind of milestone that made people do desperate, dangerous things. So I made a choice that surprised even me. Instead of stopping her, I watched her watch our daughter, and I let her have this moment. It was probably the only time she'd ever see Lila again, the only chance she'd have to witness what her sacrifice had preserved. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, I saw Clara start to move toward the exit. She was being smart, trying to leave before the crowd thinned out enough for anyone to get a clear look at her face. But as she passed my row, our eyes met across 20 feet of space and 5 years of complicated history. The recognition was instant and mutual. For just a moment, we stared at each other like two ghosts meeting in a graveyard, both of us haunted by the life we'd destroyed and the choices we'd made in its aftermath. I could have signaled security. I could have pointed her out to the people around me, made a scene that would have ended with her arrest and exposure. I could have destroyed her new life as completely as she'd once tried to destroy mine. Instead, I did something that felt both like forgiveness and like the final act of revenge. I nodded. Just once, barely perceptible, but enough to acknowledge that I'd seen her and chosen not to act. The look of shock and gratitude that crossed her face was worth more than any punishment I could have inflicted. She understood what that nod meant, that I was still in control, still the one making the rules, but that I was choosing mercy over justice for this one moment. She mouthed 2 words that I could read clearly even across the distance between us. Thank you. Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like she'd never been there at all. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside the auditorium with Lila and her boyfriend Mark, taking the kind of family photos that would eventually end up in frames on mantelpieces and office desks. Lila was glowing with happiness, talking a mile a minute about her plans for the future and how excited she was to start her new job. I wish Mom could have been here, she said, hugging me tightly as Mark snapped pictures. She would have been so proud. She would have, I agreed, and for the first time in 5 years, I meant it without any bitterness or irony. She loved you more than anything in the world. I know, Lila said. I feel her with me sometimes, you know? Like she's still watching over me somehow. If she only knew how literally true that statement was. Later that evening, after the graduation dinner and the celebration drinks and all the tearful goodbyes, I sat in my hotel room and thought about the woman in the crowd. Clara Hayes would go back to Montana now, back to her invisible life and her small apartment above Murphy's Hardware. But she'd have something she hadn't had before. Recent memories of her daughter, proof that the choice she'd made had been worth the price she'd paid. 3 days later, I received a text message from an unknown number. Just 2 words, "Thank you." I deleted it immediately, just like I'd done with the only other message Clara had ever sent me. But this time, I found myself smiling as I erased the evidence of our contact. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about understanding that everyone pays a price for their choices, and sometimes the people who hurt you are paying a price that's already high enough. Clara Hayes would live the rest of her life knowing that she'd chosen to betray the people who loved her most. She'd wake up every morning in exile, surrounded by strangers who would never know her real name or her real story. She'd go to sleep every night knowing that her daughter was growing up without her, building a life that had no place for the woman who'd given her life. That was punishment enough. And allowing her one stolen moment to see what she'd preserved through her sacrifice? That wasn't weakness or forgiveness. It was proof that I was the one who got to decide what justice looked like. 5 years after Marissa Mercer had tried to erase me from existence, I was successful, respected, and surrounded by people who loved me for who I actually was instead of who they wanted me to be. My daughter was thriving, my business was booming, and my future looked brighter than it had in decades. Meanwhile, the woman who'd tried to destroy me was living under an assumed name in a town where nobody knew her history, getting by on minimum wage and whatever mercy I chose to show her. I'd won. Completely, totally, and permanently. And the best part? She knew it too. Sometimes the most perfect revenge is simply living well while your enemies live with the consequences of their choices. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very patient, you get to be generous in victory without giving up any of the control you fought so hard to reclaim. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about balance. And after 5 years of careful orchestration, the scales had finally settled exactly where they belonged.